Yes, I'm happy to introduce the second speaker, Dr. Lena Borise, a research fellow at the at the Research Institute for Linguistics at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences in Budapest, Hungary. And Lena is also affiliated with Harvard University. She's mainly interested in how, or like amongst many things, she's interested in how prosody interacts with sentence structure and how information structure is reflected in syntax and prosody. She's also interested in the phonetics and phonology of stress and prosodic prominence. She worked on languages such as Georgian or Malia Yukki. I hope I pronounced it correctly. The second language was a dialect of Belarusian, or is still a dialect of Belarusian. Currently, her projects focus on prosody and its interaction with syntax in Iron Ossetic, which is an Iranian language, and Udmurut, which is Uralic. Today, Lena will talk about verb height, prosodic phrasing, and the flexible eye mapping hypothesis, evidence from Iron Ossetic. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction, and thank you very much for having me here. It's a delight to be part of these series. Right, so we'll go straight to the handout. We've just been told, I'll be talking about verb height, prosodic phrasing, and the flexible iota mapping hypothesis, evidence from Iron Ossetic. This is joint work between me and my co-author, David Erschler, who is based at the University of Ben Gurion in Israel. He unfortunately was not able to join us today, but he's the expert on the language. I know a little bit of Iron Ossetic, of what's related to this topic. He knows way, way more. And so if you have questions that pertain particularly to the intricacies of Iron Ossetic, you can ask them to me and I'll make sure to relay them to him. The handout itself, it's going to be a PDF handout. You have the copy, so you'll be able to download it from Dropbox and just follow along. I'll also be sharing it on the screen. There is a lot of color coding. We'll go through that as we go, but you'll also see that certain sections are highlighted light gray. Those are the sections that we're not going to be talking about right now, but again, you're welcome to ask me questions about those, just so that, you know, we managed to go through a 30-page handout in 30 minutes. And that is pretty much it. So without further ado, let me tell you what we're going to be talking about today. So what we like to do in this paper is provide novel evidence in favor of this flexible mapping between an intonational phrase, or something that I will be referring to as iota, and syntactic constituents, based on evidence from Iron Ossetic. It's an East Iranian language spoken mainly in Russia. In the existing approaches, what we learn from the literature, iota is commonly assumed to map onto a syntactic clause, but a clause, as you probably know, has been variably defined. It may be thought of as a syntactic or a semantic or information structural unit, or one whose size is maybe determined by a combination of these factors. Hamlaoui and Zendroy in recent work suggested that maybe the case is that iota is actually flexible, and so it corresponds not to a particular syntactic projection, but rather to the highest projection that hosts verbal material together with its specifier. And they refer to that as HVP. We'll keep going back to this abbreviation, HVP, as the highest verbal projection or highest projection of the verb. The advantage of this approach is that it provides this unified syntax-based account of cross-linguistic variation in iota size. But then, of course, it makes a powerful prediction that depending on verb height in a language, and specifically in those languages where verb height may be variable, depending on utterance type, that makes a prediction that iota size is also going to co-vary with verb height. And it happens so that in Iron Ossetic, we have several projections available for verb raising. And so in a sense, it provides this uniquely suitable testing ground for testing this prediction made by the flexible iota mapping hypothesis. And so what we would like to do in this talk is show that if adopting this flexible iota mapping approach, indeed, we can show that it determines the size of iota. So the size of iota in Iron Ossetic is determined by the height of the verb. And so, oops, sorry, I'm receiving messages. Yeah, good. And so we will be able to show that that is the main factor that determines iota size, the height of the verb. At the same time, we'll also be able to show that certain smaller regularities in the language, in particular the prosodic shape that WH questions take, is actually independent from syntax and is governed by constraints that are purely phonological in nature, so purely prosodic. We can think of them as markedness constraints. So the surface picture that we see in Iron Ossetic then is created by these two factors, the syntactic ones and those independent from syntax. So that is basically the talk in the nutshell. The first thing that we'll do in the talk itself, I will very quickly go over the available approaches to iota size in the literature in general. So like I said, it's been variably defined. It is assumed to, iota is assumed to map onto a syntactic clause, but a clause has been defined as an S, as some sort of a semantic information structural unit that is not necessarily isomorphic to any syntactic constituent, as a comma phrase in syntax, roughly equivalent to speech act, as a CP, as a complement of C, complement of force, as a syntactic phase, but then we need to define phases in a slightly more intricate way, and also as a TP, for example. So there is a whole host of different definitions that has been given to iota. And then, of course, we also know that certain phonological factors can also affect iota formation. For example, phonological weight is a factor that can also play a role. And there are several other ways that iota formation can interact with purely phonological constraints, markedness constraints. And so now we enter the proposal by Hamlauer and Zendroy, who suggests that, well, iota size is actually flexible. And so it corresponds to this highest projection of the verb, where the verb is defined as the verb itself, the inflection, an auxiliary, or a question particle, for example, together with the specifier of that projection. And therefore, the size of iota under this proposal is not rigidly tied to any particular syntactic projection. Instead, it just depends on the location of the verb in the syntactic tree. And the evidence for this proposal that they draw on comes from Hungarian narrow focus and Hungarian topic structures. We'll look at them in a moment. English WH questions, German V2 clauses, and also some evidence from what's called zero-coded passives in a Bantu language basa. So we will have a quick look at how this works in Hungarian. And before that, let me just introduce the constraints that they suggest this iota formation relies on. There are two align constraints that basically they basically take the edge of these, of the highest projection of the verb, the right edge and the left one, and they align those with respectively the right and the left edges of an iota. That is basically what there is to it. There is, of course, another question of whether the whole utterance, so something including what the material that is above the highest projection of the verb, what constituent that is in. They suggest that iota is recursive, so there are in fact two iotas, a core one and the maximal one. We don't have to go into this right now, but if you have questions, we can talk about them during the Q&A. So what evidence do they base this proposal on? Well, they look at, among other things, Hungarian foci and Hungarian topics. Let us actually first look at Hungarian foci. That's what you can see in 4 here. So in Hungarian, as you probably know, there is a preverbal focus position, so the narrowly focused constituent linearly is found in the position immediately left adjacent to the verb. In Hungarian, we can also tell that something is focused because in the case when a constituent is focused, the preverb, this particle meg that you can see over here, the preverb is detached from the verb and appears in the post-verbal part of the clause, whereas the constituent immediately before the verb is going to be the focused one. So this sentence says, it is Mary that Peter fell in love with, or in Hungarian, it's literally Peter, Mary love in, Peter, Mary fell in love. So the focus constituent Mary is found there right before the verb and the preverb is detached. And prosodically, these kinds of structures, as you can see, there is an iota. Iota is going to be coded blue in this presentation. The iota encompasses the preverbal focus constituent and the verb and the rest of the clause, which here is the particle. Now, syntactically, this follows from the fact that the focus constituent constituent is found in the specifier of this focus projection, and the verb is found in the head in the same projection. This therefore constitutes this HVP configuration, the highest projection of the verb, and therefore the focus constituent and the verb are predicted to form a single iota together, and they do. So this is the evidence that comes from Hungarian focus. Now, in contrast, Hungarian topic constructions, here you can see one in 2a. This one is a dog bit, the dog bit the postman, or in Hungarian, this is the postman bit the dog. Here we have the constituent, the postman, the object topicalized, so moved into the left periphery. And you can see that it is not part of the core iota. The core iota starts at the verb. We can also tell that the postman is not focused because the particle is not removed from the verb. This means that the constituent before the verb is not a focus, so it's a topicalized one. And syntactically, of course, the topicalized constituent and the verb are found in different projections, and therefore they also do not form an iota. So this is basically the kind of evidence that they present for this HVP as the core factor in iota formation. We won't have a chance to look at the rest of their data for the reasons of time, but again, we can look at it later if there is interest. And what we're going to do now instead is go straight to the basics of Iron Ossetic. So the language we'll be talking about, Iron Ossetic, is an Indo-European language, an Iranian and particularly East Iranian one. It is a member of this closely related dyad of languages. There is Iron Ossetic and Digor Ossetic. Iran speakers form a majority, but we don't know the precise numbers of how many speakers they are. According to a census made almost 20 years ago, there were around 500,000 Ossetians in Russia, but again, they speak both Iran and Digor, so we don't quite know. But this is the rough estimation for numbers that we have. And here I can show you the map of where Iron Ossetic is spoken. So here you can see that there is this area called North Ossetia in South Russia. You can also see this area of South Ossetia that is a disputed territory between Georgia and Russia. So Ossetic is spoken in both of these areas. Iron Ossetic is spoken in North Ossetia, and the speakers that we have worked with come from Vladikavkaz, so the capital of North Ossetia, or from around the surrounding area. And to give you a very quick overview of the language, here are some of the highlights of grammar. Iron Ossetic is an SOV language, but the word order is largely determined by information structure. It's mostly left branching, head final, has rich morphology, mostly suffixing, has a rich case system, complex verbs, aspectual prefixes, and a system of second position clitics. Syntactically, I don't think we have to spend a lot of time on syntax because this crowd probably is less interested in syntax than in prosody. So let me just go over this quickly. We assume the structure to be left branching as in 7. The finite verb is assembled by a series of head movements, and the subject is generated in the specifier with a little VP and moves to spec TP. So this is more or less your canonical head final tree with the specifiers being on the left. And the part of Ossetic that we're most interested in is what we call the preverbal complex. This is probably one of the most curious properties of the language. So how does this work? What we call the preverbal complex is the combination of negative indefinites, WH phrases, and foci. And we're going to have a look at each of these in parallel. So in Iron Ossetic, if an utterance contains a negative indefinite, this negative indefinite must appear immediately before the verb. And that's what you can see in 8. So 8 is a sentence that means no one loves Soslan. Literally, you say Soslan, no one loves. And the negative indefinite, the word for no one, has to be immediately left adjacent to the verb. That's why 8b is impossible, because you cannot dissociate the negative indefinite from the verb. And if you have several of these indefinites, they're all going to be, as a complex, as a string of sorts, all going to be left adjacent to the verb. That's what you can see in 8c. So no one ever tells anything to Medina is to Medina, no one, nothing, never tells. This is how you would say it in Iron Ossetic. The same law basically applies to WH questions. That's what you can see in 9. So WH phrases, just like negative indefinites, must appear immediately preverbally. And again, if there are several, they all have to be as a complex left adjacent to the verb. That's what you can see in 9a. So a sentence like who is telling what to Medina today literally is today to Medina who what says. And who and what have to be together right before the verb. You cannot have them separated from each other, and you cannot have them separated from the verb. That's what you can see in 9b. And finally, the very same constraint applies to utterances that contain narrow focus. So here in 10, we have an example, only Medina believes Alan. And here you have to have only Medina right before the verb. You cannot have it dissociated from it as in 10b. And similarly, in a response to WH question, who believes Alan, you have to say Alan Medina believes. So Medina has to be right before the verb. Now, the question is, of course, what if we have several of these elements in a single sentence? Well, if co-occurring, the order of elements in the preverbal complex is strictly focus, WH phrase, negative indefinites, and then the verb. Topicalized constituents can come can be in the left periphery, so before the focus constituent, or they can also be post-verbal. So that is basically the main regularity that we're interested in. And here in 11, I just have an example of these elements when they co-occur, but I basically have told you all that already. And syntactically, in order to account for the word order that we find within the preverbal complex, we adopt the clausal architecture above the TP as that's shown in 12. So basically, until the level of TP, as we saw in the previous figure, we have the ahead final order of the clause, but then it switches to being head initial above the level of TP. So this is basically the syntax that we assume. Now, when it comes to prosody, what we've been able to uncover based on our experimental results is that there are 3 levels of prosodic constituency above a prosodic word. There is a phonological phrase, phi, an intonational phrase, iota, and a prosodic utterance that we're not going to be able to talk about much. So what are the main properties of these prosodic constituents? Well, phi is a smaller one, and it's a domain of stress assignment. It maps onto smaller constituents such as DPs and PPs, and the way we can identify it is because it carries this single high pitch accent H star. The alignment of the high pitch accent is determined by stress placement within the stress window in a phi. Typically, phi is realized on the post-tonic syllable or the juncture between the stress syllable and the next one. And this is something that we'll be referring to as H delay. It's not going to be crucial for our talk today, but it's just so that you understand why the peaks are always moved a little bit further right than where the stress syllable is. H delay that happens to the post-tonic syllable may happen across a word boundary, but it never happens across a boundary of a phi, and of course it never happens across a boundary of an iota. Iotas may consist of more than one phi. H's on non-initial phis are suppressed. And crucially, in questions, iotas have a slightly different property in that in addition to carrying a high pitch accent, they also carry a high initial boundary tone. And that is going to be important for us going further when we talk about the prosody of WH questions. Okay, so these are the basic regularities of Iron Ossetic prosody. And like I say here at the top of page 8, we adopt this HVP hypothesis, and we'll see that it derives the right results. The last thing about Iron Ossetic prosody that I want to tell you about was how stress works. We don't have a lot of time to go into that. Basically, there is a stress window. So each phi carries a stress window of the first 2 syllables. And where stress goes within those first 2 syllables is determined by vowel quality, because Iron Ossetic contains strong and weak vowels. Strong vowels like to attract stress. If both of your vowels in the stress window are weak, then the second syllable is stressed. If both are strong, then the first one is stressed. If there is a combination of weak and strong, so weak strong or strong weak, then the strong vowel is going to be stressed. And I just have a couple examples here. But again, this is not going to be crucial for us going forward. Okay. And I'm going to skip the rest of the assumptions here that we're basically just adopting from the existing proposal, and also the traditional descriptions. why they're here, again, I can tell you more about this later. And let's go straight to our study. So what we did, we recorded, my co-author went to Asisha and recorded 13 speakers of Iron Ossetic. There were 8 males and 5 females. And what we had them do was record 118 utterances that contained declarative clauses with verbal arguments, varying syntactic complexity, WH questions of varying complexity, and utterances containing narrow foci, again, of varying syntactic complexity. So this was our data set. And the first thing that I want to tell you about is about this reality of Hstar delay. So like I told you, the realization of the acoustic realization of stress is actually delayed until the next syllable in the same phi. So let me tell you what this looks like. As you can see in figure 1, I hope you can see it clearly. Here we have the distribution of F0 peaks in stress windows of different type. So here we have a strong, 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 weak, and weak, weak stress windows. The most important fact for us to carry away from this is that the peak is indeed usually delayed. So in the first 2 lines, in the green one and the red one, you can see that the peak falls somewhere towards the end of the second syllable, even though these conditions, these stress windows, the SS and SW ones, these are the ones where stress is on the initial syllable. So stress is initial, but the peak that is associated with it is in fact realized on the second syllable. The third condition that you see here, the weak, weak stress window, you can see that here the peak is realized basically towards the end of the third syllable. And these are the conditions where stress targets the second syllable. So stress targets the ground. And I have another example showing it, but we'll have to skip it for the reasons of time. We can go back to it if there is interest. And now finally, we can go to the most interesting part, to the behavior of the actual elements in the preverbal complex. So we're going to start with negative indefinites. Like I told you already, negative indefinites are obligatorily left adjacent to the verb, and any number of negative indefinites may occur preverbally. Let us remind ourselves what this looks like. So that's what you can see in 15. If you say something like, today Alan didn't run away from anyone, it's going to look like, today Alan from no one ran away. And similarly, if you want to say, today no one ran away from anyone, that's going to look like, today no one from no one ran away. So the negative indefinites have to be immediately before the verb. The syntactic structure that we assume for that is in 16. The verb appears, head moves all the way up to the head of the negative projection, and the negative indefinite or several are found in the specifier or specifiers of the same projection. And if you recall, this is of course this HVP configuration where we have the highest projection of the verb and some material in the specifier. So the prediction then is that in these contexts, we have to have the negative indefinites and the verb phrased together be part of the same iota. And this is indeed what we find. So let me show you some examples. So this is the first example that we had on the previous page. Let me just remind you what it is. So it's, today Alan from no one ran away. And what you can see here in figure 3 is that there is a prominent peak on the word today, that's the topic. You can also see that there is a less prominent peak on the word Alan. And then finally, this is the stress syllable, rather the stress syllable is the first one. This is the syllable to which the H is delayed from the stress syllable in the word from no one, and then there is a fall in F0 towards the end of the sentence. This over here is spurious. Again, we can talk about this later. But basically what matters most for our purposes here is that this is the last site that we see an H star in, and this is indeed the stress syllable in the negative indefinite. There are no other H's, and that means that the rest of the clause forms a single iota. And then, of course, the example to compare it with is a parallel one where we have 2 negative indefinites. So figure 4 is, today no one from no one ran away. And as you can see here, again, there is a prominent peak on the topic that we're not so interested in. Then due to smoothing, you don't see it very well, but this is the peak on the first of the negative indefinites. And then there is a fall pretty much flat to the very bottom of the pitch range. That means that in this case, we have both negative indefinites grouped together into a single iota with the following verb. And I can zoom out so that you can look at these 2 pictures together. So the difference between them is basically how soon the left edge of iota starts. Because in the first figure we have 2 topics, and in the second one we only have 1, and you can see this in the steepness of the fall. So what this shows us is that what is expected, what is predicted by the HVP, we indeed find in this data in negative indefinite. Now let us look at WH questions. So first we can remind ourselves what they look like. So like I told you, WH phrases behave in a very similar way to negative indefinites in that they also occupy this immediately pre-verbal position. That's what you can see in 17. So a question like, where does Medina buy cottage cheese? In Ossetic, you would ask it in the following way: Medina, cottage cheese, where buys? So the word for the WH word has to be immediately left adjacent to the verb. And syntactically, again, the structure that we assume for it is parallel to what we saw for negative indefinites. So I'm not going to dwell on it much, but the prediction that it makes is that, again, we have to have this WH word grouped together with the following verb into a single iota, and that's indeed what we find. Before I show you an example, an interesting caveat is that this is not the case for multiple WH questions. So we'll look at multiple WH questions together because they have an interesting special kind of behavior. But before that, let's just look at simple WH questions with a single WH phrase. And as you can see over here in the data, so this is the same. This is, I should have said this earlier, this is aggregated average data from all the speakers. And I haven't been very consistent in smoothing it, so it may look more or less ragged. So what you see in figure 5 is the same WH question. So Medina, cottage cheese, where buys? And as you can see, the last H is found on the WH word, and then there is a fall in F0. So this means that the WH word and the verb form an iota together to the exclusion of the material further to the left. Now, an interesting thing about WH phrases, especially polysyllabic ones, is that they, in fact, carry 2 high-pitched targets. In monosyllabic ones, they coincide, so we can't really tell which one is there or whether both of them are there. So, but in longer WH phrases, what we see is that in addition to this stress-induced H, there is also an initial high boundary tone, this percentage sign H. Let me show you what this looks like. And again, this is going to be important for us because, like I said in the beginning, WH phrases, complex ones, those including several WH phrases and WH phrases and negative indefinites, have a special prosodic behavior. And it's the appearance of this high initial boundary tone, percentage sign H, that's going to be important for this. Let me show an example of that. So 19 is a question that contains a more complex WH phrase. So it's, which seller's spouse buys cottage cheese today? And literally in Ossetic, it is today, cottage cheese, which seller's spouse buys? And let us look at what this looks like. This has not been smoothed in order for us to see all the little bumps. So let me tell you what's where here. So today, cottage cheese, which seller's wife buys? And what we're most interested in is the area over here, because this is the WH word. And as you can see, there is a bump over here that corresponds to the stress in the word which. But there is also a target over here, and this is this initial high boundary tone that iotas formed by WH questions, but not by other elements in the preverbal complex, carry. And that's going to be important for us going forward. We're going to skip the interaction of WH questions, WH phrases with clitics for the reasons of time. And let me go straight to preverbal foci. So again, to remind ourselves, a focused XP, if present, is immediately preverbal in Iron Ossetic, and that's what you can see in 21. So a response to a question like, who trusts Alan, is going to be Alan, Medina trusts. And a response to questions such as, what is Alan drinking, is going to be Alan, beer drinks. So you can see that the narrowly focused constituent is going to be found immediately before the verb. Now, syntactically, as you probably guessed by now, what we assume for this is that there is a dedicated focus projection such that the verb moves into the head of it, and the narrowly focused constituent is going to be found in its specifier. And again, we're making a prediction that the focus constituent and the verb are going to form an iota together, and that is indeed the case. It looks pretty much parallel to what we've seen so far, so I'm going to skip the data in the interest of time. And go to a more interesting case. In particular, like I told you already, the preverbal complex may contain several elements, right? And so if we have something like 23, where there is a focused element and a negative indefinite, it will look the following way. So 23a is a question like, who does no one trust in your family? And you can respond to that by saying, in our family, Alan, no one trusts. And B is, who does no one ever trust in your family? And the response is, in our family, Alan, no one never trusts. So crucially, in terms of word order, as you can see here, the negative indefinites are going to be the ones that are closest to the verb, whereas the focused constituent is going to be further to the left. And this is the only word order that can obtain. And if we think about the syntax of these, the prediction that we make is that, well, the verb in these is going to be in the head of the negative phrase. The negative indefinites are going to be in the specifier of these phrases, of this phrase. And the focus constituent is going to be higher up in the syntactic tree. So the prediction that we're making is that the negative indefinites and the verb are going to form an iota together to the exclusion of the focus constituent. And that is indeed the case. That's what you can see here in figure 10. So this is our sentence, in our family, Alan, no one never trusts. And you can see that it's not the case that from Alan we fall flat down, which would be the case if there was a single iota formed by the focused constituent, negative indefinites, and the verb. Instead, we can see what remains of the stress on the first negative indefinite. It's not very pronounced, but you can see that it's there. So this, again, adheres to the same generalization. So far, it's been very smooth air. We've seen that everything seems to adhere to the generalization that we're making. But then, of course, there are some more complex cases. And in particular, these are the ones that involve multiple WH questions or multiple WH questions that involve negative indefinites. Now, let us look at the behavior of these. So if we have a WH question that also involves negative indefinites, that's what you can see in 24. So who does Medina never tell anything? In Ascetic is going to go like Medina, to whom never nothing tells. And crucially, our word order is going to be such that the negative indefinites are closer to the verb and the WH word is going to be further to the left. Now, in 25, you can see the prediction that is made by the approach that we've been advocating so far. So we've looked at 25a in the previous section. We've seen that what happens in these cases is that the negative indefinite is grouped into a single iota with the verb, whereas the focus is outside of that iota. So the prediction we're making for WH questions in the same environment is that the same should happen. However, that is not what we find. What we find indeed is what you see in 26. So a question like, who does Medina never tell anything? The left edge of the iota is actually found at the left edge of the WH phrase. So it includes the WH phrase and the negative indefinites and the verb. So you can see it in 27b, and this unexpected left edge iota boundary, I'm going to mark with this red with an exclamation mark. So the actual attested pattern does not follow from the syntax alone. And I have it here in the figure in 11. Again, we'll have to skip it for the interest of time, but you can see here that the peak is indeed on the WH phrase, and then there are no other peaks on the negative indefinites, which suggests this grouping between everything. So the WH phrase, negative indefinites, and the verb. Now, why would that be the case? Well, the explanation that we would like to offer is that prosodic structure formation, like we said in the beginning, is governed by factors that come from these two independent sources, those rooted in syntax, and these are the ones that we've been looking at so far, and also purely prosodic ones, so eurythmic constraints or markedness constraints that are independent from syntax and are instead a reflection of the prosodic requirements of a language. And when these eurythmic constraints are ranked higher than the match constraints between the syntactic and prosodic structure, then non-isomorphism can arise between syntax and prosody. And that's indeed what we see in Iron Ossetic. So if we're saying that something is going on, something interesting is going on in the prosody of these complex WH phrases, what would it be? Well, recall that we told you in the beginning that there is this high initial boundary tone, percentage sign H, that is a unique feature of iotas formed by WH questions. It is not present in iotas formed by other kinds of elements of the preverbal complex. And that's what I can show you in figure 12 and figure 13. The actual stress windows are not important for us here, but what you can see is that in WH questions, when stress is on the second syllable, there is another target on the initial syllable as well. And this is not the case in iotas formed by negative indefinites, for example. That's what you can see in figure 13. Here, again, the stress, the H that is induced by stress is realized on the second syllable, and there is nothing on the initial syllable. So it is this difference in the initial syllable that we're referring to as this initial high boundary tone on WH phrases. Now, why is it important? Well, we would like to suggest that it's specifically this initial boundary tone that is more aggressive than other initial boundaries of iotas. In particular, what happens when it's present is what we call the post %H dephrasing. So all iota boundaries to the right of this special boundary tone, other than those formed by another such special boundary tone, are deleted. And this is something that is reminiscent of accounts of focus in Japanese, for example. And so what we would like to suggest is that instead of so prosody of WH questions, instead of being rooted in syntax alone, is also influenced by this independent prosodic requirement. And it is also this requirement that explains the prosody of multiple WH questions, where, as you can see over here, each of the WH phrases carries its own left iota boundary, which is represented by this boundary tone, which we can actually see in longer WH phrases. I'm aware of time, so we're going to wrap it up here. So we're going to skip the prosody of declaratives. We can talk about this in the Q&A period if you're interested. And let me just very quickly summarize what I have told you. Oops. I hope that I have shown to you that the flexible iota mapping approach, but not more rigidly iota formation, not the approaches that take iota to be more rigid, we can talk about that more, can account for the properties of iota formation in Iron Ossetic. This applies to prosody of utterances that contain negative indefinites, narrow foci, and single WH phrases. On the other hand, the Iron Ossetic facts, of course, also provide support for this flexible iota mapping approach, because again, other approaches, probably those that more rigid ones, would not be as successful in accounting for this kind of data. I've also shown you that more complex WH questions, in addition to being governed by this HVP configuration, are also governed by prosodic factors. And finally, the alignment of Hstar is interesting in declaratives. We were not able to talk about that, but I'm interested. I will be happy to talk about that during the Q&A if there is interest. And I've been told that this means thank you very much in Japanese. I hope it does. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Lena. And that's correct Japanese. So that's good. If anyone has a question, please send your name and affiliation to me, certainly. And yeah. So there were lots of information that we were exposed to, so it's great. And the first question comes from Cedric Patel from University of Lille.
Hi again. Thank you for this talk. A lot of information. I'm not sure I was able to deal with everything. I was wondering about your post H depressing constraint. How do you link it with possible recursion on the prosodic side? So can't we just think that there's some kind of recursion, and that instead of deletion, it may just be some kind of lowering in a recursive structure or something like that? I'm not sure I'm clear, I hope.
I think, let me just restate your question to make sure I understand it. So I think your question is that...
Lena, do you mind sharing the PDF while you are answering the question? Yeah.
Absolutely, let's do that. Just a moment. So let me just go to the relevant example. So I think your question is about examples like what we've seen in... no, actually, I think it's going to be on the previous page. Just give me a moment. So it's going to be like these ones. So your idea is that, well, it may be the case that in 26, for example, there is another iota boundary that is here at the left edge of the negative indefinite. Is that what you mean? Right. I'm staying agnostic as to whether there is recursion of this sort, because we don't have direct prosodic evidence for it. The evidence that we could, the way that we could argue for or against it would be purely based on our theoretic requirements. I have not thought as far yet, and I don't know what really which would be the best from the point of view of Occam's razor, for example, whether we should assume it one way or another. Just based on what we see in the acoustics, there is no evidence for it one way or another. That's why I did not indicate it here, though of course the question of recursion itself is a very interesting one. I guess it could have flown past very quickly, but if we look at our multiple WH questions, we didn't have a chance to look at 29. As you may notice here, for these iotas, the special ones, I actually only indicate one of the right brackets because I'm not entirely sure, just based on what we see in the acoustic signal, whether the second right boundary should go over here, so whether the iotas should be sisters, or whether they should be recursive, whether the second iota boundary should be at the very end. I don't think there is a way to decide just based on what we see in the data, so I'm staying agnostic with respect to it for now. But of course, there are theoretical considerations that go into this, whether we allow recursion of iotas. This is the same that also goes for the left peripheral topics, of course. So Hamlaoui and Zendroy take iotas to be recursive, so there is the core one, and then there is the maximal one, which also includes the left peripheral material. The caveat with that is that we need to assume that if there are several topics in the left periphery, there are no iota boundaries between them. They all belong to the same maximal iota, and they're excluded from the core iota. This is debated whether this is the case in Hungarian. This is not the case in Ossetic. It doesn't look like all the topics are going to form a single iota. So that's why I'm using this utterance phrase for the whole utterance, and I'm trying to stay away from saying that iotas are recursive, but this is indeed probably one of the most interesting theoretical questions here. So if you have any ideas about whether I should sway one way or another, I'm very curious to hear from you.
No, I don't have this idea, sorry. But thank you for your answer, it's really clear.
Thank you. Oops. Yep. We are kind of, we are in the 40-minute mark, but we still have some time for question if you have any. Apparently, we have one more question, but from the same person.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So you're not the creator of the flexible iota hypothesis, but I have a question on it. So since you assume it, maybe you can answer. I wonder how, in fact, the constraints that usually aligns with projections have access to the fact that there is a verb inside. And I was wondering if you have other evidence for access to categories or morphological information in addition to the prosodic and projecting aspects of it.
Thank you. That's another great question. I do not have, I think, as good a response to this as the creators of the framework. But the idea seems to be, let me share my screen again, just to go to the relevant page of the handout. As you could have noticed, they define this highest verbal projection in a very flexible way. They say that it may include the verb, verbal material. Let's see what this is. Over here. So the verb itself, verbal inflection, and auxiliary or a question particle. That's what you can see over here. So the verb itself, inflection, auxiliary, or a question particle, and that's going to be this HVP. So this is very broadly defined, of course. There is no discussion in the papers, as far as I am aware, as to exactly how prosody accesses this information about where the verb is. But this seems to be observationally correct, in the evidence that they provide. So coming from Hungarian, coming from Germanic and Bantu, that it is indeed the position of some sort of verbal material that plays the main role in this. Of course, yes, then it is an interesting question, how exactly does prosody know where the verb is? That's probably why some approaches to iota suggest that it is a syntactic phase. Then, of course, we need to define phases in a particular way. But then it would be nice for prosody, because we compose a phase, we dispatch it to PF, and that's how we know we take the highest projection there, for example. But this proposal is not based on phases. So yeah, again, that is a very good question that I probably don't have a very good answer to, but this would be something for me to think about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Lena. And I think I will give, we will have more time to discuss after the formal closing. So some people in Europe might need to go and have lunch, and in Asia, it's dinner time. If you are awake in North America, it means you need to go to bed soon. It's already late, probably. So let me let me wrap up today's events and continue our discussion afterwards. First, I would like to thank the two assistants, Yukki Baldoria Wu and Miyu Iizuka, as well as the Liaison Institute assistant Michinori Suzuki, who was behind organizing today's event. This event was supported by shared budget of ICU research institutes and in particular for Institute for Educational Research and Service and the Linguistic Lab at ICU. The next part of this colloquium series on porosity will be 2 weeks from now, on October 24th. Frank Kügler from Goethe University Frankfurt and Nancy Kula from University of Essex will share their research. And the talks will start at 5 p.m. Japan Standard Time. Let me also advertise another talk series that's ongoing at the moment. We have a phonetic talk series in collaboration with Keio University. And next week, that's not 2 weeks from now, next week we have Timo Röttger from University of Osnabrück and Adam Chong from Queen Mary University of London giving a presentation. This would be a rare opportunity for European colleagues to join, because they're in Europe. So we will have it in the same time. Other talks in that series all happen when Europe is 3 a.m. So I don't think many colleagues can join at the time. More information can be found, including titles and abstracts, on the ICU-LINC website. So thank you all who participated in today's colloquium, and we hope to see you on October 24th. We're going to stop the recording now.